Go ahead, Avni.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to KRVIA Encounters. Today, we have Dr. Edna with us. Dr. Edna is an award winning urbanist and researcher. She specializes in making public spaces inclusive, safe, and humane for vulnerable populations. Trained as an architect and urbanist, Edna has focused on merging research and practice to improve security in public spaces by focusing on users through the lens of intersectionality. Edna has a PhD on urban security from the University Paris City. She has collaborated with European and American municipalities, NGOs, researchers, and universities with the goal of improving security in public spaces. Her work on public space analysis ranges from research papers to multimedia projects and artistic installations, and it has been showcased in various international platforms, such as the Foundation Palladio, Oxford Urbanist, and the Journal of Public Spaces. Welcome, Edna, to KRVI Encounters. You may now begin. You're on mute.
Yeah, I was saying thank you very much for the introduction. I believe right now you can see the PowerPoint.
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, wonderful. So, yeah, thank you for being here today. And we'll start with this presentation titled Shaping Public Spaces Through the Lens of Security, where we will discuss. First, we will take a short historic overview about how we have included security in the way we make cities and public spaces. And then we will discuss how architects and city makers in general apply security to their projects nowadays. So let's start. This presentation is partially is a part of the results from a PhD thesis I made at Université Paris Cité, where I researched the relationship between feelings of insecurity, public spaces, and daily practices of vulnerable populations. This is only a part of this research. So, making cities safe is really nothing new. As we can see from European and medieval cities, for example, walls were built around the city to protect from the dangers of the outside. Later on, in cities that were the product of European colonization, and in this case, the city of Mexico, after the arrival of Spanish conquistadors, these cities were articulated with the goal of, one, armed defense, and two, the eradication of pre-Hispanic societies. And here we are starting to see a theme that we will see throughout the presentation. Who is in power can define what the danger is and can define how we act when facing this or trying to prevent this apparent danger. With the demographic growth and the new means of production of the Industrial Revolution, the European cities outgrew their pre-modern limits of the walls. And now the risk was not coming from the outside. We were looking at the inside, all the problems that came from this unprecedented growth of cities. Philosophers of on urban planning in the late 18th century and early 19th century favored the application of science and technology to solve many issues, ranging from economy, morals, work ethic, those things that these philosophers posited that could be improved through the clever application of architecture and urban planning. So we see these utopias of social order. For example, the Phalanstère by Charles Fourier, the garden city concept of Ebenezer Howard, this aim to make a city more healthy, more productive, and of course, safer. But perhaps one of the most emblematic projects that related to security in this line of thinking was Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. Probably you already heard about this. It was this idea, usually applied to prisons, where there's a watchtower in the center. People around can see the tower, but cannot see really who is inside watching them. So there's always this risk that someone might be watching what they're doing. So the population, in a way, regulates itself. And this principle was believed that could be applied to any other typology, for example, schools or hospitals, to guarantee order and peace. At an urban level, we see also transformations. For example, Paris, in the transformations of Paris in 1853, this creation of these grand boulevards that end in a very nice view of the opera or the Arc de Triomphe that we see a lot of on Instagram. They were actually the product of this thinking of the 19th century of making the city more clean, but also in the case of Paris, it was those boulevards were widened to allow the access of law enforcement and to make it harder for people to build barricades and protest. And also, one of the consequences of these transformations was the raising of working class boroughs. So we fast forward to the 20th century, and architects start taking the role of master planners. The popular idea of the time for city planning was along the lines of what Le Corbusier called a machine for living. And this thinking was quite successful in the US, and it also set a trend for many cities around the world. And in the US, in this case, these highly efficient cities were planned for cars. And of course, they were highly publicized by automobile and oil sectors. Here we can see like this principle applies not to an American city, but to a Latin American city of Brasilia that was made from scratch. And we can say that these modern cities have an impressive wide angle view and also from above. We have all seen photographs of the monumental plazas in Brasilia with these beautiful buildings by Oscar Niemeyer and Lucio Costa. They are quite imposing. They are modern. They actually say are a way to convey to the world that we are a modern city. We're a proper city. However, when we look at a street level, it's a different story. For starters, zoning was a very popular strategy for city planning at the time. However, zoning reduced public space to circulation only. It was not meant for social interaction. In consequence, it also destroyed the human scale of neighborhoods. If we make these wide boulevards that can allow cars to go as fast as possible, it's very hard for people to use the streets as a place for interacting. This in turn eroded social cohesion, meaning the street is no longer a place for encounters, positive encounters, and it also favored anonymity. In turn, this makes the streets less safe. And not everyone can afford to use a car or live in the high, beautiful buildings. So it is the less wealthy population that continue to use the public space, even in unfavorable conditions. And they are also the ones who are often ejected or rejected from these spaces. The poor are often seen as a source of security issues. And thus, the less wealthy neighborhoods are often targeted for raising, and in consequence, homes are displaced, along with businesses, which increases social segregation. At an urban level, we can see that the places where the rich people live and the poor people live. This segregation puts the members of a community in vulnerable positions. Oftentimes, they end up living in slums. And they end up falling victims of exploitation of landowners and criminals. And this, in turn, makes them more likely to experience violence, direct and systemic, in their everyday life. Social segregation becomes a feature of the urban landscape as the upper classes feel threatened by the urban poor. However, we do not oftentimes we do not take into account the kind of violence that's not limited to just crime that happens for these vulnerable populations. So we have this division of the city, where the city is different according to for you. You have different access to the city according to your income. We have the formal city and the informal city. The formal city, where housing, transportation, commerce, access to industrial employment, and property rights are defined. And the informal city, where you see squatters, ambiguous property rights, and lack of services, and the criminalization of marginality. And in this formal and informal city, we can also see the discourse that one side is the one that should be protected, and the other side is the side we should protect them from. They are often criminalized. So during these past years in the 20th century, various theories linking crime, architecture, and urban planning have emerged. Here we have some of the most popular ones, starting with the Chicago School of Theory of Social Disorganization, that talked a lot about the link between crime and neighborhoods. They also talked about the relationship between crime rates and other social problems such as poverty and health. Then we have Jane Jacobs, who was, she was not an architect, she was an activist, married to an architect actually, but her criticism on what was happening in New York in the 60s with this, what I was saying earlier, with this raising of neighborhoods that in the end damaged the urban poor and marginalized populations, was very important in understanding what is the value of the city at the ground level. Later on, we see Oscar Newman's defensible space, whose focus is on the design of housing environments that make it easier for them to be naturally surveyed, and the development of territoriality in these spaces. We have Ray Jeffries' Crime Prevention through Environmental Design, who basically lists a series of principles that should be followed to create, well, safe environments where crime does not happen, or at least crime can be prevented. And of course, we have Wilson and Keeley's theory of broken windows. Now, this is a theory that states that maintaining order and preventing crime go hand in hand. In this case, the broken window means if we go through a neighborhood and we see a broken window, that means no one's caring for this space, meaning no one is surveilling this space, meaning all sorts of crime can happen. Now, this theory has also been the subject of debate. Actually, all of them have been criticized, and they continue to be used to this day. So, after all this overview of history, what is the role of the architect in making safe spaces? It is often defined by the scale and the typology of the project. Where is the project located? What kind of activities will users carry out in it? Is it a public project? Does it allow non-residents? Some of these are the questions that we have in mind when we are working as architects in the architectural object. So, at a micro level, architects can incorporate specific features into the design of the building that work to protect a group of users or to prevent certain events from happening. So right now we're only looking at the building that we're usually working on as an architect. We have the power to define where security cameras go. We can design a project to have few blind spots or spaces where someone can hide. We can define the position of windows that allow to see from the inside but prevent to be seen from the outside. In our project, we can define the location of security cameras, alarms, checkpoints, security exits. And through well thought out design, we as architects can articulate flows within a building which is open to the public in such a way that allows for crowd surveillance and crowd control. We can direct people to the places they should go and make them stray away from the place they should go. And this can be integrated into the design in such a way that users do not feel absurd. As we can see in the slide, when it comes to housing architecture, we create basically fortifications to live in. Or, for example, again, going back to the case of the United States, it's been quite a trendy subject to think of new ways to design schools that reduce impact of mass shootings, sadly. However, we must also take into account what happens what happens with this kind of architecture. As I mentioned earlier, the question of power is very important. We as architects are subjugated to power structures. We design for those who can afford a specialist. So, amounting with the scope of the architectural project, architects can inadvertently contribute to foster larger social divides between those who use the design space and therefore are protected and those who don't. So I'm sure you're familiar with the saying, form follows function. In this case, when we take into account security, it's rather form follows fear. However, the question remains, form and fear according to whom? As I mentioned, those who are in power, those who can afford an architect, those who can raise their voices and affect decisions at a certain level, are the ones who say, the danger is here and we have to protect us from them, from that danger. And sometimes this articulation or this definition of what the danger is can be very narrow. It can forget to take into account other types of violence who are not necessarily crime. And that's another thing we have to take also into account. Not all crime is violence, and not all violence is treated as a crime. So we already talked about the micro level. We're going to talk about the macro level. How do our decisions impact the city at a larger scale? These security measures that we can implement in a building, they can have negative repercussions when we think of the city in the same way. Now, a building can refuse entry to people who don't live there or who don't work there. For example, a bank needs to have a controlled access. A residential building or a house, it has a very specific user who has to be there, who has the right to be there, and other users who have no business being there. But we cannot treat the city the same way. The city is public by definition. The city belongs to everyone. So then here's the contrast. If we think the city through the same lens as we think the protection of buildings, this tends to produce fragmented spaces that reproduce inequality and structural violence. At a larger scale, zero tolerance, hostile architecture, target hardening, septed, they do not create spaces for everyone. Hostile architecture, for example, this is the image we see in the middle, is a strategy that uses the elements of the built environment to purposely deter activities in certain spaces. In this case, well, it would be hard for someone to walk there, to sit, or to sleep there even. While its proponents argue that hostile architecture, or rather defensive architecture, it's also called that way, helps maintain social order, critics posit that such strategies enforce social divisions. Why? Because they target homeless individuals disproportionately, those who have no choice but to sleep under a piece of architecture like that. And they are making it impossible for them. And it also affects vulnerable populations, such as the elderly. Another strategy, for example, of hostile architecture that aims to maintain social order is to make bus stops uncomfortable, so that you're only comfortable for a very short while, but often, well, the elderly need a little bit more time to rest because of their limited mobility, and this kind of architecture is hostile to them. So again, this kind of architecture only fosters wider or defines more clearly the right one can have to access the city, and those who are considered worthy of protection, and those who are considered as the source of the problem. So, what is the alternative? We as architects, okay, we have seen that these strategies that we often use are not necessarily in the best interests of everyone. And particularly when we talk larger scale. So as architects, we may help define how a building and its occupants stay safe, but our influence on whatever happens beyond the project borders is quite limited. So rather than helping to combat insecurity at its root, insecurity is not necessarily poverty, even if we have talked about that a lot. It's a product of systemic violence towards and segregation. But as architects, we are often limited again to the borders of a project. And unfortunately, we as architects, we can turn this architectural object as a product of the fear of those who are worthy of protection. Other than providing protection to the clients of the buildings or the building's users, there is little a building can do to improve larger issues of security by itself. Security is, however, much more than a problem of keeping a building, its contents, and its users safe. When looking at security as a social problem that can be solved at a larger scale rather than a building, space becomes an accessory that contributes to the proposed solutions and it should articulate different perspectives at the same time. So we're looking rather at the urbanist's role in security prevention. Now, in many cases, shifting towards urbanism is almost a natural succession of the architect's background and formation and education. But although urbanists and architects share a common knowledge of designing and constructing buildings, architects and urbanists and their role as professional differs greatly from region to region. So, still, the space has a very important role in transformation. Sorry, in trying to make public spaces safe. However, in most recent times, there have been attempts and experiments to have a more social, add a more social angle to these transformations. So we're going to discuss right now spatial transformations for security through inclusion and through participation. And we're going to talk about a specific trend, which is social urbanism, which started in Medellin, Colombia, between 2004 and 2011. As you can see in the little map here in the corner, here's the location of Colombia. Now, what is social urbanism? First, we need to talk about what was going on in Colombia. And as is the case in many Latin American countries, in the 90s, very important escalation of violence due to organized crime activities happened, making the cities safe and particularly making marginalized spaces, meaning informal neighborhoods or lower class neighborhoods, much more vulnerable. People were feeling unsafe. And as I mentioned, oftentimes it was attributed to these lower class neighborhoods. So after decades of trying to combat organized crime and violence through the presence of law enforcement, there was this shift of perspective, which was social urbanism. Social urbanism are state-led interventions that address violence and inequality through improvements in transport, education, facilities, and public spaces in low-income, crime-ridden, and marginalized communities, those who are affected the most by violence. So, to put it to simplify it, this perspective aims to stop seeing security, stop looking at security and start looking at violence, which are not the same thing. Meaning that we are not seeing as, again, this dichotomy of those who are worthy of protection and those who are the ones we need to be protected from. So basically, and the answer to that dichotomy would be both. In this case, we take a step back, we look at the city, we look at the population, and observe violence. We observe that oftentimes these low-income and marginalized communities have very little resources and very little opportunities to get formal housing or work or education. And the public space and the material transformations are also important here. So, for example, in the picture we're seeing, that's the Metrocable. Many of these communities were located in the hillsides of Medellin. And one of the issues was that it was quite isolated in terms of public transportation. So one of the strategies was to, put public transportation into place that was adequate and easy to access. There were also programs to co-design with the people both social programs and to create spaces with their needs and their wants in mind. Now, these activities have been highly publicized, again, because they are very innovative and they are very visible. As we can see, they are colorful and they are quite clever. And of course, the idea of another way of attacking a security problem, one of the most infamous security problems in the continent, it of course attracted a lot of attention. And of course, these strategies were partially replicated in cities around the world. Now, we have to say that social urbanism is not necessarily a foolproof strategy. As I mentioned, it's always important to include various perspectives. And in this case, the architects were not necessarily the master planners as we saw in the first half of the 20th century. It was rather one of the many specializations, expertise that came into play, along with social workers, along with sociologists and geographers. However, frequently, when reproducing these strategies of social urbanism, we only focus in the facades and the physical transformations. So I'm going to talk about an example of one of these reproductions. This is a picture of the Colonia Palmitas in the center of Mexico. It is a space known, or well, yes, unfortunately, there's a lot of crime in this neighborhood. And in 2015, there was this initiative by government and companies and activists to do this social urbanism adjacent activities to combat crime. And this is how it ends. From a white, gray space, it became these rainbow colors that we can see from far away. And it made the rounds all around the world. Different journals were talking about, for example, this one, a macro mural against violence. This other one, artists in Mexico turned low-income neighborhood into one giant mural. So it was discussed a lot, and it was, again, it's a very attractive idea to say that through paint and through the volunteering of people in the neighborhood and a positive attitude and good ideas, we can combat crime. It sounds wonderful. However, like I mentioned in another case earlier, when you look at the ground level, the things are very different. There were really not many improvements done to the way people live and move in this neighborhood. As we can see, cars are parked on the sidewalks. The sidewalks are minimal. People are walking on the street proper. The buildings are not necessarily improved. So what's changed? And after authorities and photographers and the artists left, of course, this project was done also with the help of the people that live there. But after all that, a few years later, at least 3 years after the project is finished, neighbors report that crime hasn't diminished. It's basically the same. And there are no plans for maintenance or upkeeping these pretty colors. And unfortunately, this is a project that keeps attracting tourists. So tourists everywhere come and take photos with the beautiful macro mural that you can see from afar. And that's it. There's really no more income for the people there. There's no security for the people there. And unfortunately, again, these are strategies that keep being done over and over again under the label of social urbanism or tactical urbanism or guerrilla urbanism. But in the end, it's just paint over the facade of people who maybe cannot afford this and who lack all the things that make social urbanism effective. The social participation, the social angle, the actual contact and taking into account of what people need. For such a strategy to actually work, the paint of the facades, and if we can see a butterfly or an eagle or a rainbow from the other side of the city, that's the least important part of the project. The most important part of the project is to improve quality of life in these spaces. And then we can talk about an effective strategy for the prevention of violence. So, some final thoughts about this theory. As we saw throughout the presentation, public space transformations are not for everyone. What do I mean by this? Well, we already talked about these power structures to which we as architects are subjected. Not everyone can afford an architect, but also not everyone can have their voices heard. Oftentimes, those who can raise their voice and say, this is the danger, this is the crime, or whatever you want to call it, that we should attend to, are oftentimes not necessarily those that are affected the most. And oftentimes, marginalized populations, vulnerable populations, such as women, the elderly, the homeless, are not considered into these discussions. So whatever discussions are being had, whatever solutions are being proposed, they happen over there, up there, and those on the ground, those that actually experience public space, are often ignored. In the best of cases, in the worst of cases, they are criminalized. The antithesis of insecurity is not security, but inclusion. As I mentioned earlier, thinking the city as through the lens of security oftentimes produces walls. But insecurity has its roots in violence. So how do we tackle violence in the different ways to be presented, which is direct violence or structural violence? It's for inclusion. And lastly, we have to think of architecture as the backdrop, not as the protagonist. And most importantly, we have to think of architecture as a backdrop. The more we zoom out and the more we are pulling away from the architectural object and towards seeing the city. The architectural piece should not be, or rather the material part should not be the main event, as we saw with the partial application of social urbanism, where the main thing, the protagonist, was making the facades pretty and nice to be photographed from afar. But there's nothing happening, really. There's nothing changing for the population that lives there. Finally, some ideas for a course of action. If we are ever involved in this kind of projects, we have to involve various actors. Of course, we are as architects and possibly urbanists, we are very well trained to understand the effects space has on people, but we also need to involve various actors, and not only actors who are specialists in other fields such as sociology or geography or psychology. We also need to involve activists. We need to involve associations, schools, people who may not be experts on design and territorial organization, but who are much more knowledgeable on the phenomena in the public space or in the space we're working on. We have to be aware of socio-spatial inequality. We have to ask ourselves, what are the problems of inequality and how do they manifest in public space? We have to identify and work with vulnerable populations, women, elderly, children, LGBT people, immigrants, handicapped individuals. And we also have to be aware that oftentimes these various identities overlap. So it's not going to be the same perception of public space of, for example, a wealthy woman than that of a poor man. It's not going to be the same of a woman without any limited mobility as a handicapped women. We also have to be aware of the interactions of these characteristics. And we have to also ask ourselves, what types of violence do they face in public space? Because oftentimes, what they consider violence is often treated as trivial by the discourses of those in power, the predominant discourse. For example, we tell women that they are paranoid and that whatever they're experiencing in public space does not happen. Suck it up. We need to step away from that. And lastly, we have to ask ourselves, who is being excluded from the creation process? Again, as I mentioned earlier, not everyone's voices are equally heard in these discourses. They are often suppressed or minimized, ignored. We have to ask ourselves that and how we can integrate in the creation process. So this is the finish of this is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. You can follow me at CTC Tech Ciudad on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And please, if you have any questions, well, we're going to go to the Q&A. But if you are very shy or something, feel free to send me an email at ctctechciudad@gmail.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. If anybody has any questions, they can raise their hands or directly unmute, or they can post it in the chat as well. Yes, Jana. You can ask your question.
Yeah, so hi, I had a question about if the project is greater than just a singular structure, where it's like almost like an urban planning project. How do we kind of navigate around the concepts of high crime neighborhoods, where it might be due to the current power structure that selective, racially marginalized communities and their living spaces are being targeted as high crime neighborhoods. So how do we find a way to kind of shed away that idea of high crime neighborhoods in a larger project where it's spanning over a city or something like that?
Okay, let me see if I understood the question correctly. So how can we navigate the issue in a larger project of these marginalized neighborhoods and how they are considered as unsafe?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is it's a tricky question. Of course, it's very complicated, and it's not something that we as the architects can do. I think that we are, as architects, sometimes quite enamored with the idea that us ourselves can be like the brilliant architect of the 20th century, whose name is going to be in the facade of the building. Unfortunately, when it comes to city making, it's a team effort. So sometimes our power of decision as individuals, even in a larger scale project, is going to be limited because we have sometimes someone up there who's going to be very focused on the idea that these neighborhoods are full of criminals and we have to raise them. I think one of the most important things we can do is be aware of these issues and communicate that to other people. And also that sometimes our individual actions or individual instinct in the face of insecurity may be right, but it's not necessarily going to be right at a larger scale. So a silly example, for example, when we receive a punch, we try to protect ourselves instinctively. And sometimes that's a strategy that we try to use with a city at a larger scale. The punches being a crime, so we have to protect it. We have to do this. It's a nice strategy for an individual, but it's not a good strategy for a city because that only makes it even more unsafe, even more violent, particularly towards these vulnerable populations, and even more segregated. So we have to be aware of this. We have to communicate this and be aware of our level of possible action that we can take, and we'll take it as much as we can.
Hope that answered your question, Jana. Do
Yeah,
you have any
thank you
other
so
question? Or does anybody else have any question?
There's one in the chat, Avni. Shravan has posted it.
I'll read that out. Urban security is generally seen as a means of keeping the other out of spaces in a subtle, underhanded manner. But when spaces see an overt discrimination, like during the era of segregation in the US and South Africa, or in rural areas of countries like India, where the caste discrimination is much more obvious, where the discrimination is more widespread and accepted, does the architecture maintain these subtle barriers, or does the hostility of the architecture turn more obvious as well?
Okay, let me reread the question. Yeah, definitely. As I mentioned, architect is oftentimes, and there's this quote of a Mexican author that says that architecture is the ultimate history, the witness of history, meaning that architecture is the reflection of a certain train of thought, of a certain zeitgeist. And I definitely agree to the spirit of this quote. Going back to the issues of power, oftentimes we as architects are going to reproduce these trends, and we especially when security is seen as a problem that we have to act, and we have to act immediately. There's little room about, okay, let's take it easy, let's take a step back, try to solve the issue from a more holistic perspective that integrates various angles. And for example, in the case of architecture, the client is going to be, I don't care about that, I want my building safe. I want the homeless out of my porch. I want security cameras here to avoid all sorts of things from happening in front of my building. So yeah, they actually do reproduce these barriers. And that's why what I wanted to discuss in my presentation, the issue of the microscale, the building, where oftentimes we have very limited agency and limited impact on violence at large. But we do have a much more better possibility of tackling violence issues when we work at a city level and when we work with a lot of people. Going back to the question that was asked first, we need to work with various specialists and various actors if we want to reverse this reproduction of barriers. Okay, and we have another question, I think.
Yeah, I'll read that out. Can you say a few words about the role of improving urban security in the process of gentrification of low-income neighborhood and their perception as being unsafe places to live?
Yeah, and actually, one of the issues of gentrification is usually this process of inserting a new population, a new type of activity in an otherwise poor or undesirable neighborhood, and which in turn evicts the original people who were living there. So a trend that I have also seen in these spaces where speculation is rampant are these strategies of tactical urbanism or social urbanism that maybe they start out with very nice intentions of getting people together and making experiments so that the street is a nicer place to be. And precisely to change this perception that people may have of this neighborhood. Unfortunately, and I have like actually been in those projects. Oftentimes, these projects that aim to make this dangerous, this low-income neighborhood better, do not involve the low-income residents. For example, when I started as an architect, I was actually very interested in tactical urbanism and all that. And I went to this tactical urbanism event in a low-income neighborhood, and it was really nice. As a young architect, I was like, wow, we are painting the streets and doing these things with palettes and all that. And it wasn't until a lot of time later that I realized, like, we were only architects there, and none of us lived there. None of us lived in that neighborhood. We came from all over the city to do these nice things of tactical urbanism and take pictures and upload it to Instagram and all that. But none of us were actually the real users of those spaces. And nowadays, that space now has very fancy cafes and art galleries and all this sort of hip things to do. And indeed, neighbors started leaving that space. So it's this improvement of urban security, again, going back to the issue of power, it's not necessarily improving the perception of security that people have in these low-income neighbors. It's improving the perception that people have from the outside. Sometimes these activities are aimed at persuading those who don't live there that that is a nice place to live in, that you don't have to be afraid. And in the process, gentrifying, speculating with the territory. So if we want not to do this, we have to really look at what the people there need. Because oftentimes they are aware of security issues, but they're not going to be like, oh my God, I'm so afraid of living there. No, they are aware of those security issues, but they don't have any other way out but to learn to navigate through them. Like, I live in a low-income neighborhood. Of course, I'm aware that I can get mugged at night, so that's why I don't go out at night. So that's why I don't go through this street. So that's why I don't go to this place at this time of day. So we need to be very skillful and sensitive to interact with in this case, the users, the actual users. I hope this answered your question.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question. Hi, Edna. I am the Dean of the Master's Program in Architecture and Urban Conservation. Thanks for this wonderful lecture. I think you brought some of the very important issues to our students, especially in the city of Mumbai, which has so many informal settlements. I would just like to ask, what is your thoughts about Urban Think Tank and the work that they're doing in informal settlements in Rio de Janeiro and Caracas and various other projects? And do you think projects of that scale will make a big difference in these informal settlements as well?
I'm really not well acquainted with the urban think tank activities. I haven't heard, but I am acquainted with other, usually international initiatives in low-income neighborhoods to improve quality of life or education or health in general. And these are very positive actions, I think, but frequently the issue is that they come from international initiatives. They oftentimes, when they are in place, they try to hire or to get into their team local people, but frequently the entry is usually for upper class individuals who are highly educated, who speak at least 2 languages, and who may or may not live in this, and usually they don't, live in those low-income neighborhoods, and who oftentimes are not necessarily very sensitive to social inequality. So that's one of the obstacles, not necessarily in the. I'm not talking specifically of the urban think tank, but that I have seen in other international initiatives. And also, there is a lack of maintenance and follow-up. Frequently, okay, they go and they do these actions, and it's very nice. It's very good. The photos are taken, and what happens later? Frequently, there is very little follow-up or support from public authorities in place. So, if there is no follow-up, if there is no way of keeping this in the very long term, it's going to go down. And there is also the issue of trust from the populations that live there, because frequently they are the playground for all these international initiatives to improve all sorts of things. But they know that that's not going to improve it in the long term. So they are like, okay, we're going to take what we can benefit at the moment, and yeah, we're going to talk about long term. We don't care, because we know that you cannot keep that promise. So again, I'm not familiar with the urban think tank actions, but these are the things that I have seen repeatedly in international projects all over the world. So those are things that we have to take into account.
Okay. Yep. The urban think tank is Alfredo Billenberg, and they actually, kind of liaisons with the people, the dwellers in these impoverished neighborhoods. They've done quite a few projects, like a music school in the slums in Sao Paulo and various kind of things. So that's why I thought probably you'll have some idea about how successful they've won a lot of awards, and they're right out there. But I was wondering whether you had a first-hand experience of their work. So anyway, thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ainsley. Does anybody else have any other questions?
I don't think there are any more questions, Avni. It was, I think, yeah, very interesting, because we have urban studies that take place at the fourth year pre-final level, and there are a few students who are very interested in taking forward this thought in their thesis projects in the final year. And I think your lecture will help them kind of give them direction. Though, of course, context-wise, there might be a large kind of difference, or there might be different complexities involved in our context, but I think that it would give them a good direction. We can draw on some fine line of similarities, that we have a similar fort wall that we used to have in the late 1700s, Mumbai had, and of course we've all studied Haussmannization of Paris, and bringing in more light and ventilation and all of that. But with the socio-political kind of influences, or the perception that is created about safety, is something else altogether. And it would be really very challenging to know how an architect can actually bring about that kind of change. So that was a wonderful lecture, Edna. Thank you so much for being patient with us and meeting us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Your questions were very thought-provoking. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a wonderful opportunity to talk to your students.
Yeah, so our director wasn't able to be with us today. He's at a conference, but he was the one who actually initiated this, inviting you actually. Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, I hope this was useful for you guys in the audience. And again, you can follow me on social media. And as I said, feel free to reach out through email if you want, like, if you were very shy to publicly ask a question or something. And best of luck for those who are doing their theses and following your semesters. And well, good luck.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thanks, Ainsley. Bye.